I stumbled upon your video 2 nights ago, the one where a Saudi executioner knelt before Christ the moment he realized a young woman's life had been snatched too soon. I watched with tears in my eyes as he shared how, in that instant, he understood he wasn't alone in his doubts or his search for something real. That confession felt like a lifeline thrown across the void I've carried in my heart. Tonight, I sit here with the Quran open on my lap, no Bible in sight, its gold script glowing softly under my desk lamp. As I read the familiar verses, a voice unlike any shakes whispers my name. My breath catches. There is no one else in the room, but deep in my chest I hear it again. Isa. That single word rises like a prayer I've been too frightened to speak. This is the beginning I both feared and longed for. The moment when everything I thought I knew becomes a question I can no longer ignore. Growing up in our house was like living inside a prayer. Everything had its place, its time, its proper way. My father was more than a man in our community. He was the voice that called others to prayer, the one who explained the verses, who settled disputes with quotations from the prophet. Our family name meant something. It meant respect, tradition, the kind of honor that comes from generations of faithful service. I was the eldest son, which meant I was destined to follow in his footsteps, to become the next link in a chain that stretched back centuries. Our home breathed Islam. The call to prayer echoed from speakers mounted in every room. Prayer rugs were spread across the marble floors 5 times a day, and we moved through our rituals like dancers who had memorized every step. My mother covered her head even inside our own walls, and she taught me that love meant obedience, that questioning was the first step toward damnation. The Quran wasn't just a book in our house, it was the only book that mattered. The final word on everything from how to wash before prayer to whom I would marry. But even as a child, something gnawed at me. I remember sitting in the mosque, listening to my father read about punishment for those who strayed, about the fire waiting for unbelievers. The other boys sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed forward. But I found myself staring at their faces, searching for some sign that they felt what I felt. A kind of sickness in the stomach, a whisper that asked why God would create people just to watch them burn. I learned to keep my face as blank as theirs, to nod when the adults spoke of divine justice. But inside, a small voice kept asking, why can't we just believe in good? Why does it have to hurt so much? When I turned 15, my father handed me a leather-bound copy of the Quran and told me it was time to memorize the harder verses, the ones that separated the faithful from the weak. I spent hours each night in my room reciting the Arabic syllables until they carved themselves into my memory. But there were passages that made my chest tight, verses about the cursed ones, the enemies of Allah, the ones destined for eternal punishment. I would read these words and see the faces of my Christian neighbors, the old man who sold fruit at the market and always smiled at me, the woman who helped my mother when she was sick. Were these people really damned? Was their kindness just deception? I tried to push these thoughts away, but they grew stronger. Sometimes I would catch myself holding my breath while reading, as if the words themselves might poison me if I let them too deep into my lungs. One night, I found one of the other boys from our study group crying behind the mosque. When I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with such fear that I stepped back. "Don't you feel it?" he whispered. "When we read those verses, don't you feel like something is dying inside?" I wanted to tell him yes, that I felt it too, that sometimes I lay awake wondering if God was really as angry as the verses made him sound. But before I could speak, he shook his head and ran away. The next week, his family moved to another city. I never saw him again, but I knew why he'd left. Some questions were too dangerous to ask out loud. The breaking point came during my final year at the madrasa. I had been struggling for months with a passage about showing no mercy to unbelievers, and finally, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. After class, I approached my favorite teacher, the one who had always been kind to me, who had answered my smaller questions with patience. I told him about the knot in my stomach, about how the words felt sharp in my mouth, about how I couldn't understand why Allah would want us to hate instead of heal. His face changed instantly. The warmth I had known for years turned to ice, and when he spoke, his voice was barely controlled fury. "You are walking the path of betrayal," he said. "To question these words is to question Allah himself. Would you rather follow your feelings than follow God?" He didn't wait for my answer. Within hours, my father knew everything. That night, they sat me down in our living room, my father, my uncle, 2 men from the mosque council, and told me I was becoming dangerous. They spoke of boys who had been sent away for correction, young men whose families never spoke of them again. It was then that I learned what had happened to my cousin Rashid, the one who had suddenly disappeared the summer before. My uncle let it slip. Rashid had been caught reading about Christians online, asking questions about Jesus. They had sent him to a place where such thoughts could be beaten out of him. As I sat there, surrounded by the men who were supposed to love me, I understood that doubt wasn't just wrong. It was lethal. One more question, one more moment of hesitation, and I might disappear too. University was supposed to be my escape, but I carried the fear with me like a stone in my chest. I studied business, kept my head down, prayed at the right times, said the right words. But loneliness has a way of making you desperate. And when Marcus invited me to coffee after our economics class, I was too hungry for friendship to care that he wore a small cross around his neck. Marcus never preached to me. He was gentle, funny, the kind of person who made you feel like the best version of yourself. But one day, when I was complaining about feeling lost, about going through the motions of a life that didn't feel like mine, he quietly pulled out a small book. "This has helped me when I feel that way," he said, handing me a pocket Bible. "Just if you're curious." I should have handed it back. I should have walked away. Instead, I took it home and hid it under my mattress like some shameful secret. For weeks, it stayed there untouched, but eventually, curiosity won. I opened it to a random page and read words that made no sense in the context of everything I'd been taught. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Peacemakers, not warriors, not those who conquered, but those who made peace. I found myself comparing this to the verses I'd memorized, the ones about striking down enemies, about showing no mercy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that single line, about how different it sounded from everything I'd been raised to believe. For the first time in my life, I wondered if there might be another way to know God, a way that didn't require me to carry so much anger and fear. It started 3 months later, on a Tuesday night when I couldn't sleep. I had gotten up to pray, to recite the late-night verses that were supposed to bring peace. I opened my Quran to a passage I had read hundreds of times about Allah's mercy and guidance. But as I began to recite the familiar Arabic words, something impossible happened. I heard a voice. Not my voice, not my father's voice, not the voice of any imam I had ever known. This voice was speaking to me in my own language, but it wasn't coming from the pages. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere that felt like the center of my chest. The voice was gentle, almost musical, and it said just 3 words: "I am here." I stopped reading. My hands were shaking. I looked around my small apartment, expecting to see someone, but I was completely alone. I tried to continue reading, to push away what had just happened, but the voice came again, softer this time. "You are not alone." I slammed the book shut and sat there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't how God was supposed to speak. God spoke through revelation, through prophets, through the words that had already been written. God didn't whisper in your bedroom in the middle of the night, didn't use your own language, didn't sound so close, so loving. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that stress and late nights had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew what I had heard was real and terrifying, and somehow more beautiful than anything I had ever experienced. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't read the Quran the same way anymore. The words that had once felt solid and unchangeable now seemed to shimmer and shift on the page, as if they were waiting for something, or someone, to breathe new meaning into them. The voice didn't come every time I opened the book, but when it did, it transformed everything I thought I understood about God, about faith, about myself. It started small. I would be reciting the morning prayers, the same Arabic syllables I had been pronouncing since childhood, when suddenly I would hear my name woven through the familiar sounds, not interrupting them, not replacing them, but somehow speaking through them, like a second melody playing underneath the first. The voice was always gentle, always patient, never demanding or harsh like the sermons I had grown up with. "I see you," it would whisper during verses about Allah's omniscience, and the words would hit my chest like warm water on frozen ground. "Come closer," it would murmur through passages about the straight path, and I would feel drawn toward something I couldn't name but desperately wanted to understand. And always, always, there was that name rising in my spirit, like a song I had been trying to remember my whole life. Isa, Jesus. The voice followed me everywhere. I would hear it on the subway, a gentle presence threading through the clatter and chaos of rush-hour commuters. "You are not alone," it would say as I sat surrounded by strangers, and suddenly the crowded train car would feel less like a prison and more like a room full of people who were all searching for the same thing I was. I would hear it during university lectures, during conversations with friends, during the long, quiet hours when I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was losing my mind. But it was strongest in the mosque. During Friday prayers, When hundreds of voices would join together in recitation, I would close my eyes and listen for that other voice, the one that spoke my language instead of Arabic, the one that called me by the name my mother had whispered when I was born, rather than the titles and epithets I had learned to attach to my identity. Sometimes I wondered if anyone else could hear it. If the man praying beside me was also trembling with recognition, but their faces remained serene and focused, while mine burned with questions I didn't dare voice. The dangerous part was how normal it started to feel. Within weeks, I was unconsciously listening for that voice during every prayer, every reading, every moment of spiritual practice. It became as natural as breathing and infinitely more necessary. My religious observances stopped feeling like duty and started feeling like conversations with someone who actually wanted to hear from me, who was genuinely interested in what I thought and felt and feared. That's when I started listening to Christian sermons online. It began innocently enough. I told myself I was just curious about what Marcus believed, just trying to understand why his faith made him seem so peaceful, while mine often left me anxious and afraid. I would wait until my roommate was asleep, then put on headphones and search for videos that might explain why Jesus felt so familiar when everything I had been taught said he should feel foreign. The first sermon I found was about Jesus calling his disciples, and I listened with tears streaming down my face as the pastor described how Christ didn't choose perfect people or religious experts, but ordinary men who were willing to leave everything they knew to follow a voice that promised them something better. The way he talked about Jesus, as if he were a real person you could have conversations with, someone who cared about your daily struggles and midnight fears, was completely different from anything I had ever heard about God. Every night I would delete my browsing history and clear my cookies, terrified that Ahmed would discover my secret research. But I couldn't stop. Each sermon felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. Each mention of Jesus' love, like water on ground that had been dry for decades. I learned about grace, the radical idea that God's love wasn't something you earned through perfect behavior, but something freely given to imperfect people. I learned about redemption, the possibility that your worst mistakes could become the very places where God's love shines brightest. But the fear was constant, a cold presence sitting in my chest like a stone. In my culture, abandoning Islam for Christianity wasn't just about changing religions. It was about betraying your family, your community, your entire identity. I had seen what happened to people who strayed from the path. Families would declare them dead, communities would shun them, and in the worst cases, they would simply disappear. I knew that every sermon I listened to, every moment I spent entertaining thoughts about Jesus, was another step toward a cliff I might not be able to climb back from. The internal war was exhausting. During the day, I would go through the motions of being a faithful Muslim, attending prayers, participating in discussions about Islamic theology, nodding along when professors or friends talked about the superiority of our faith over others. But at night, in the privacy of my room, I would whisper Jesus' name into the darkness and feel my heart respond like it was finally hearing its own language. I started having panic attacks. They would hit without warning, during meals with friends, in the middle of classes, while walking across campus. My chest would tighten, my breathing would become shallow. and I would feel like I was drowning in the space between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. I was too Muslim for the Christians I was reading about, too Christian for the Muslims I was surrounded by, and too confused to know which way to step without losing everything. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't talk to Ahmed about what I was experiencing because he would report it to my family before I finished my first sentence. I couldn't confide in Marcus because admitting I was questioning Islam felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. I couldn't even journal about it because writing down those thoughts would create evidence that could destroy me if anyone found it. So I lived in limbo, torn between the voice that was calling me toward something beautiful and the voices that had shaped my entire life, warning me that beauty was just temptation in disguise. I was addicted to hope, to the possibility that God might actually be the gentle presence I encountered in my secret prayers, rather than the distant judge I had always feared. But I was equally addicted to safety, to the familiar prison of expectations and traditions that might suffocate me but would never abandon me. Every day felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing I would eventually have to choose between the life I had always known and the life that voice was inviting me toward, terrified of what either choice might cost me. The dream came on a Thursday night in April, after weeks of listening to sermons with my headphones pressed tight against my ears, always checking the door, always ready to slam my laptop shut if I heard footsteps in the hallway. I had fallen asleep to the sound of a pastor reading from Matthew, his voice gentle as he spoke about Jesus calling his disciples to follow him, and I drifted off, wondering what it would feel like to hear that invitation myself. I found myself standing in what looked like my childhood bedroom, but everything was different. Brighter, more vivid, as if someone had turned up the saturation on reality itself. The walls were the same pale blue my mother had painted when I was 7, the same wooden desk where I'd spent countless hours memorizing Quranic verses, but the air felt thick with presence, heavy with something I couldn't name, but desperately wanted to breathe deeper. There was someone by the window, and though the figure's back was turned to me, I knew immediately who it was. My heart began to race, not with fear, but with recognition, like seeing a friend you'd been searching for in a crowded marketplace. Light poured from his hands, not harsh fluorescent light or blinding sunlight, but something warm and golden, like honey mixed with starlight, like the first rays of dawn after the longest night of your life. He turned toward me, and I couldn't see his face clearly. It was as if I was looking at him through water or through tears I hadn't realized I was crying. But his eyes, oh God, his eyes held everything I had been hungry for my entire life. There was no judgment there, no disappointment, no anger at my questions or my doubts. There was only love, the kind of love that sees straight through all your walls and defenses and chooses to stay anyway. I started crying then, not the quiet tears that slip down your cheeks when you're trying to be strong, but the kind of sobbing that comes from a place so deep you forgot it existed. My knees buckled, and I found myself on the floor of that impossible bedroom, weeping like a child who had been lost for days and finally heard his mother calling his name. The tears felt like they were washing away years of fear, years of pretending, years of believing I was too broken or too wrong or too dangerous to be loved. He didn't speak, not with words anyway. but I felt his presence wrap around me like arms that had been waiting to hold me since before I was born. In that embrace, I understood things that had never made sense before. I understood why I had always felt like a stranger in my own life, why the verses about God's wrath had made my stomach turn, why that voice in the coffee shop and in my apartment had sounded so familiar. I had been made for this love, created for this relationship, and everything else had just been preparation. The light from his hands grew brighter, and suddenly I could see my whole life spread out like a map. Every moment of doubt, every question that had made me feel guilty, every time I had wondered if God might be different than what I'd been taught, it had all been leading here, to this room, to this meeting, to this recognition that I was known and loved and called by name. I tried to speak, tried to ask all the questions that had been burning in my chest for months, but no words came. Instead, I felt his answer flowing through me like water through dry ground. I felt forgiveness for doubts I hadn't even confessed, felt acceptance for the parts of myself I had tried to hide, felt invitation to step into something bigger and more beautiful than I had ever imagined possible. When I woke up, my pillow was soaked with tears and my whole body was shaking. But for the first time in my life, the shaking wasn't from fear. It was from joy, from relief, from the overwhelming realization that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't alone, that the voice I had been hearing was real and true and more trustworthy than anything I had ever known. I sat up in my narrow bed, the morning light filtering through my small window, and did something I had never done before. I prayed, not in Arabic, not from memory, not because it was the right time or because someone expected it of me. I prayed because I finally had someone to talk to, someone who knew my real name and wanted to hear my real voice. Jesus, I whispered into the quiet of my room, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on my tongue. If that was really you, if you're really here, please don't let this be just a dream. I can't go back to pretending anymore. I can't keep living like I don't know who you are. The words felt dangerous and liberating at the same time, like jumping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. That morning, everything looked different. The same cramped apartment, the same view of the alley behind our building, the same routine of classes and prayers and careful conversations. But now, it all felt temporary, like I was just passing through on my way to somewhere else, somewhere that had been waiting for me all along. The certainty lasted exactly 18 hours. I should have known that peace never lasts long when you're living a double life. The next afternoon, as I sat in the university library pretending to study for my economics exam, my phone buzzed with a text from my roommate Ahmed. "We need to talk, now." The words sent ice through my veins, but I told myself it could be anything. Maybe he needed help with rent. Maybe his girlfriend had broken up with him again. Maybe he just wanted to complain about our neighbors. But when I walked into our apartment, Ahmed wasn't alone. My uncle Mahmoud sat on our cheap couch like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence, his thick hands folded in his lap, his eyes harder than I had ever seen them. Ahmed stood by the window, unable to look at me directly, and I knew immediately what had happened. My phone. He had seen my phone. "Show him," my uncle said quietly, and Ahmed pulled out his own phone, scrolling to a screenshot he had taken of my browser history. Christian sermons, Bible study websites, a forum called Seeking Jesus in Islam, where I had posted questions under a fake name. The evidence of my betrayal glowed on the screen like accusations written in fire. My uncle stood slowly, his 6-foot frame filling the small room with authority I had learned to fear since childhood. "Your father is on his way," he said, his voice controlled but barely containing something dangerous underneath. "He should be here by morning. Until then, you will stay exactly where I can see you." Ahmed mumbled an excuse about needing to be somewhere else and disappeared, leaving me alone with a man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders at family gatherings, but now looked at me like I was something diseased that might contaminate everything around me. The next 24 hours blurred together into a nightmare of whispered phone calls, stern faces, and the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. When my father arrived, he brought 2 other men with him, elders from our mosque back home, men whose approval had meant everything to me when I was a child. Now they sat in our living room like a tribunal, their voices low and serious as they discussed what to do with me. They decided on isolation first. "To help you think clearly," my father explained as they moved me to my uncle's basement, a concrete room with a single mattress, a prayer rug, and a copy of the Quran. "Away from the influences that have confused you." The word "confused" hung in the air like smoke. They wanted to believe this was temporary, that whatever poison had infected my mind could be extracted if they just applied the right pressure in the right places. For 6 days, I lived in that basement. They brought me food twice a day, simple meals of rice and lentils that reminded me of childhood, and spent the rest of their time trying to save my soul. My father would sit across from me on the concrete floor, reading verses about Allah's mercy and justice, his voice carrying the same authority that had shaped my entire worldview. "Remember who you are," he would say after each session. "Remember where you come from. Remember what we taught you about truth." The other men took different approaches. My uncle preferred lectures about young men who had been seduced by Western lies, about the emptiness that waited for those who abandoned their heritage. Elder Rashid, a man I had respected since boyhood, spoke softly about family honor, about the shame that would follow our name if word of my apostasy spread through the community. "Your mother cries every night," he told me. "She prays for Allah to heal whatever sickness has taken hold of your heart." But the worst was Elder Hassan, who had taught me to read Arabic when I was 7. He would sit in the corner of the basement, saying nothing, just watching me with eyes full of disappointment that cut deeper than any words. Sometimes he would shake his head slowly, as if watching a promising student throw away everything he had worked to achieve. "I taught you better than this," he said once, and then returned to his silent observation. They wanted me to confess, to renounce whatever lies I had been reading, to return to the straight path with public repentance that would restore honor to our family. Each day they grew more frustrated with my silence, more convinced that stronger measures might be necessary. On the 4th night, I heard them talking upstairs about places where young men could be properly corrected, facilities where dangerous thoughts could be removed like tumors before they spread to others. But something extraordinary happened in that dark basement, something they could never have predicted. The voice came back, stronger than ever, when shame would threaten to drown me, when their words would start to make me doubt what I had experienced. I would hear that gentle whisper, "I am here, you are not abandoned." In the deepest part of the night, when fear made it impossible to sleep, I would feel that same presence from my dream, wrapping around me like invisible arms. On the fifth night, as I sat staring at the Quran they had left for me, hoping for some sign of what to do, the book fell open in my hands to a passage about Allah's guidance for those who seek truth. But instead of the condemnation I expected, instead of verses about punishment for those who stray, I heard that beloved voice reading the words to me, transforming them into something entirely different. The Arabic text seemed to shimmer and shift, and underneath the familiar syllables, I heard promises about love that never lets go, about a shepherd who searches for lost sheep, about doors that open when you knock. I understood then that staying would mean spending the rest of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't, suffocating the voice that had become more real to me than my own heartbeat. It would mean watching my parents' relief as I performed the role of the repentant son, while inside, the truth withered and died. It would mean safety and acceptance, and the slow, careful death of everything that had made me feel alive for the first time in my life. That night, I made my choice. I would rather lose everything I had always known than lose the one thing I had finally found. The escape plan came together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. Marcus had been searching for me ever since Ahmed stopped answering his calls, and through a network of people I never could have imagined. A Christian professor who knew my uncle's neighbor, a taxi driver who had helped others cross borders, a woman who ran a safe house near the checkpoint. Word reached me that Tuesday was my only chance. At 3 in the morning, while my uncle slept upstairs and my father dozed in the chair by the basement door, I used a loose brick I had been working on for days to create a gap in the small window near the ceiling. The opening was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and I scraped skin off my arms, pulling myself through. But suddenly I was outside, breathing free air for the first time in a week, my bare feet touching grass wet with dew. I ran through neighborhoods I had known since childhood, past the mosque where I had learned to pray, past the school where I had memorized my first Quranic verses, past the market where my mother bought vegetables every Friday morning. Everything looked different in the darkness, smaller, more fragile, like a world I was already leaving behind. With each step, I felt pieces of my old identity falling away like clothes that no longer fit. The border was supposed to be 20 kilometers away, but I had no car, no phone, no money except the few bills I had hidden in my shoe. I walked for hours, my feet bleeding inside my worn sneakers, my lungs burning from the cold night air, praying to Jesus with every step that he would keep me invisible until I reached safety. Sometimes I heard cars in the distance and dove into ditches beside the road, lying flat in the mud until the headlights passed. By dawn, I could see the checkpoint in the distance, a small building with bright lights and 2 guards walking back and forth with weapons slung across their shoulders. The sight should have filled me with hope, but instead, terror gripped my chest like a fist. This was the moment of no return. Once I tried to cross, there would be no going back, no explaining away my absence as a misunderstanding. No chance to reconcile with the family that had shaped every day of my life until now. I waited until the sun was fully up, until there were other people moving around the border area. Farmers heading to work, women carrying baskets of vegetables to sell. And then I started walking toward the checkpoint, trying to look casual, trying to blend in with the morning crowd. But I was 20 meters away when everything fell apart. "You there, stop." The voice cut through the morning air like a blade, and I turned to see 3 guards running toward me, their faces grim with purpose. My legs turned to water. I had no passport, no documents, no explanation that would make sense to men whose job was to catch people exactly like me. "Where do you think you're going?" the lead guard demanded, his hand resting on his weapon. I opened my mouth to lie, to make up some story about visiting relatives or running an errand for my father, but no words came. Instead, I stood there in the morning mud, shaking like a child, waiting for them to drag me back to everything I had tried to leave behind. In that moment, with nowhere left to run and no clever plan to save me, I did the only thing I could think of. I prayed one last desperate prayer, not caring who heard me, not caring what it might cost. "Jesus, if you are real, if you have been calling me all this time, if that dream meant anything at all, please, I'm begging you, save me now. I can't do this alone anymore." What happened next, I still struggle to understand. The lead guard, a man who had been shouting at me moments before, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. And he stared at me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. His grip loosened on his weapon, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "Go," he said, so quietly I thought I had imagined it. "Just go." His partners looked at him like he had lost his mind. "What are you doing?" one of them demanded. "We need to check his papers, find out who sent him." But the lead guard shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off me, like he was looking at someone else entirely. "I said go," he repeated, and this time his voice carried an authority that made the other guards step back. Now. I didn't wait for them to change their minds. I stumbled across the invisible line that separated one country from another, my legs barely holding me up, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear the guards arguing, their voices fading as I walked deeper into territory that felt like another planet entirely. That night, in a refugee camp that smelled of cooking fires and hope deferred, I lay on a thin mattress under a tarp that leaked starlight, and Jesus came to me one final time. Not in a dream this time, but in what felt like the most real moment of my entire existence. I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and solid, and heard his voice clearer than I had ever heard my own thoughts. "You are mine. You always have been. Welcome home." The words broke something open inside me that had been locked tight my whole life. I cried until my throat was raw, cried until my chest ached, cried until the fear and shame and confusion of 23 years finally cracked apart and let something new grow in the spaces between. For the first time in my life, I felt peace. Not the temporary quiet that comes from following rules perfectly, but the deep, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you are loved exactly as you are. Scars and questions and dangerous prayers included, I understood then that everything that had brought me to this moment, every doubt, Every fear, every night spent listening to forbidden sermons, every tear shed in that basement, had been orchestrated by hands I was only beginning to recognize. I had thought I was running away, but I had actually been running towards something that had been waiting for me since before I took my first breath. The boy who had memorized Quranic verses to please his father was gone. In his place was someone I barely recognized but instantly loved, someone who belonged to Jesus, someone who had finally come home. 3 years have passed since that night in the refugee camp, and I live quietly now in a small apartment above a bakery in a city where no one knows my old name. The smell of fresh bread rises through my floorboards every morning at 5, and I've learned to think of it as my alarm clock, a gentle reminder that I've survived another night and been given another day to be grateful for the impossible gift of freedom. I work at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where students spend hours hunched over laptops and office workers grab their caffeine before disappearing into buildings that scrape the sky. My manager hired me despite my broken English and lack of references, and I've learned that small acts of kindness from strangers can feel like miracles when you're starting over with nothing but the clothes on your back and a heart full of dangerous hope. The work is simple, making lattes, wiping tables, restocking pastries that remind me of sweets my mother used to buy on feast days. But every interaction feels like practice for becoming the person Jesus called me to be. When the businessman snaps at me because his order is taking too long, I remember how patient that voice was in my basement prison. When the college student breaks down crying over her phone, I slip an extra cookie onto her plate and whisper that tomorrow might be better. My apartment is small but mine. A single room with a bed, a desk, a window that faces east toward the sunrise, and a bookshelf filled with books I never could have owned in my old life. The Bible sits there openly now, no longer hidden under mattresses or disguised in phone apps. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it in amazement, remembering the terror I used to feel at the thought of being caught with those pages, those words that turned out to be invitations rather than condemnations. But the real work happens in the evenings, after the coffee shop closes and the city settles into its nightly rhythm. I sit at my desk with my laptop open, writing messages to people I will probably never meet, but whose pain I recognize like looking into a mirror. They find me through forums and chat rooms, through whispered recommendations and desperate internet searches. Former Muslims, former Hindus, former atheists, former everything who have heard their names called in the darkness and don't know what to do with the terrifying beauty of that experience. Last week, a woman named Fatima from Pakistan sent me a message that made my hands shake as I read it. She had been listening to Christian music secretly for months, hiding earbuds under her hijab, and during morning prayers, she kept hearing a gentle voice speaking her name through the Arabic verses. "Am I losing my mind?" she wrote. "Is this real? Or am I so desperate for love that I'm imagining voices? Please tell me you understand what this feels like." I spent 2 hours crafting my response, remembering my own desperation, my own fear that I was either going crazy or stepping into something that would cost me everything I had ever known. I told her about that Thursday night dream, about the voice that transformed Quranic verses into love letters, about the border guard whose eyes saw something that made him let me pass. I told her she wasn't losing her mind. She was finding it, maybe for the first time. There's Ahmed from Bangladesh, who dreams about Jesus every few weeks, but wakes up convinced he's betraying his family's legacy. There's Priya from Mumbai, who started reading the Bible after her Hindu prayers began feeling empty, and now she can't stop crying during worship songs she plays when her parents aren't home. There's David from California, who grew up atheist, but keeps having visions of light during his meditation practice. And he's terrified to tell anyone because it sounds too much like the religious experiences he spent years mocking. Each story is different, but the thread that connects them all is that voice. Gentle, persistent, calling people by name, meeting them exactly where they are, loving them through the very books and practices they thought would keep them separated from God forever. I've learned that Jesus doesn't wait for us to get our theology perfect or our circumstances sorted out. He meets us in mosques and temples and meditation cushions and midnight moments of desperation, whispering our real names until we finally have the courage to listen. Sometimes the people who write to me are angry. They've lost families, jobs, entire identities for following that voice, and they want to know why Jesus couldn't have called them in a way that didn't require losing everything. I understand that anger because I've felt it too, especially during the first lonely months when freedom felt more like exile, and I wondered if I had traded one kind of prison for another. But then I remember that night in the refugee camp, the weight of his hand on my shoulder, the way peace flooded every broken place inside me until I was more whole than I had ever been. I remember walking across that border into a life I couldn't have imagined, carried by hands I couldn't see, but had learned to trust completely. And I know that whatever it cost to follow that voice, it was worth it for the joy of finally being known, finally being loved, finally being home. The hardest messages to answer are from people whose families have found them out, who are facing the same basement imprisonments and correction facilities I barely escaped. All I can tell them is what that voice told me in my darkest moments. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. And the love that called you by name will never let you go, no matter what it looks like from the outside. Tonight, as I finish writing responses to 17 different people across 4 continents, I feel the weight and wonder of what my life has become. I am nobody famous, nobody important by the world's standards. I serve coffee and live in a room barely bigger than my uncle's basement. But every week, I get to be part of miracles, part of people hearing their names called, part of hearts recognizing the voice they were created to follow, part of love that refuses to be contained by the boundaries we think define us. If you're watching this, if you've made it to the end of my story, I need you to know something that might change everything. That voice you've been hearing, that gentle whisper that speaks your name through whatever holy book you've been reading, that presence you feel during prayers or meditation or quiet moments when you think you're alone, that's Jesus. He's been calling you, probably longer than you realize, definitely longer than you've been listening. You don't need permission to respond. You don't need anyone's approval to seek truth. You don't need to have all your questions answered before you take the first step toward the voice that knows you better than you know yourself. Just whisper his name into whatever darkness you're carrying, Jesus, and watch how he transforms everything you thought you understood about love, about God, about the beautiful, dangerous, absolutely worth it adventure of following him home.